looking at all the possible inputs of factors of production and all the possible resulting outputs. So for instance, if it was a firm manufacturing clay pots, the number of clay pots would be the output, the hours of labor, the pounds of clay, the number of various capital goods would be the output, and then you have this table telling you how much output you're going to get and vary these other things. The first thing to note about a production function is it's a real relationship. It's a physical relationship. Right? It's telling you the number of physical units you got to put in and the number of physical units you're going to get out. Now, if you're willing to engage in a sufficient level of aggregation, you can start thinking about a production function for an economy. And if you wanted to be real elaborate, you would have real output as a function of labor, and capital, and natural resources, and technology, and human capital, and efficiency, and a whole bunch of other things. Usually natural resources can be left out because they can be treated like capital. So many of the production functions in growth theory simplify by having real output as a function of labor, capital, and technology, or in the case of the Cobb-Douglas production function, labor, capital, and technology. Now this has major, remember this is supposed to be a physical relationship. That creates major problems. Because Y is a heterogeneous assortment of goods, right? And K is a heterogeneous assortment of goods. You could sort of fudge a little and think about hours of labor. How do you get around this? Well, you get around this one way by looking at real GDP. You notice you're introducing prices. And this is even more of a problem with capital. This is one of the points that Ben Powell made in the article. And so really, if you're going to be rigorous, these production functions are assuming that there is only one good in the economy. And that one good is both the output and the capital. Once you start translating this model into reality, right, you have to start using prices, and prices end up distorting whether you're actually getting a genuine physical measure. And we will come back to that later. So your Cobb-Douglas production function, if you put in some numbers, gives you output depending on the various levels of input, but usually production functions are translated into what are sometimes called short-run production functions, where you fix all factors except one. And so ManQ gives you, assuming the capital stock is constant, assuming technology is constant, is looking at real GDP as a function of the labor input, N sub L for labor, and draws the conclusion that given a fixed level of capital and given a fixed technology, as you increase the labor input, you're going to get an increase in output, but at diminishing returns. And I have no objection. If to that formulation. Now, these diminishing returns to labor, right? The first derivative of this curve is what's known, what Mankiw refers to as the marginal product of labor. But to be clear, I refer to it as the marginal physical product of labor. And of course, it's downward sloping as the labor input increases. Right? In other words, you add more workers and they're producing more, but I think of a Pizza Hut, right, with a fixed number of ovens, a fixed supply of pizzas, right, and you add more workers and you get more output. But eventually, each worker adds a little less to output, and you can actually approach negative returns if they start bumping into each other and stumbling over each other. Now, if we simplify and assume that all firms are price takers, in other words, that you have what's misleadingly called perfect competition, then this becomes the demand curve for labor in real terms. Why? Well, let's say the price of the output of this firm is fixed at that level, right? And you have that many workers, right? And that's their marginal physical product. That means you're going to be earning pure profits because each additional worker, if you're paying the worker, right, that wage, each additional worker is going to increase the firm's output more than you're paying them, and so you'll hire more workers. And if you're down here, you'll hire fewer workers. So, in other words, in Mankiw's presentation, this is where you're earning pure profits. The firm is earning pure profits, and it pays the firm to hire more workers. And this is where the firm is suffering losses. And this is where pure profits are at zero. In other words, the revenue of the firm covers all opportunity costs. Have I made that clear enough?
What is the line over capital technology? Is that just
that means they're constant. Now, if this determines the demand curve for labor in real terms, right, that's the real wage, then we can also say that the marginal physical product of labor times the price of the output equals the nominal wage. And this is referred to as the marginal revenue product. Pardon me, marginal value product. In other words, the equilibrium wage in real terms is the marginal physical product. The equilibrium wage in nominal terms is the marginal value product. And this applies not just to labor, but to all factors of production. You may have had this in micro. Is everybody with me? Now, we're oversimplifying by assuming that all the firms are price takers. In a micro course, you might get into a more complicated world where the firms are price searchers. And if the firms are price, well, let me put this here, marginal value product. MVP equals marginal physical product times the price equals the nominal wage. This equals the real wage. If it's an economy of of price searchers, then it's a little bit more complicated. Workers earn their marginal revenue product, which is the marginal physical product, not times the price of output, but times the firm's marginal revenue. And I'm only adding that just so you are aware that it gets more complicated, but we don't need to go into that. So now, all right, you've derived this as the demand curve for labor, right? This marginal physical product is the demand for labor in real terms. If you've got an economy of price takers, it is close to that. I mean, the difference between the marginal revenue product and the marginal value product is not that great. So in both of them, the marginal physical product is determining the demand curve for labor. It's just a little bit more complicated with price searchers rather than price takers. So the marginal physical product is the demand for labor. The real demand for labor is a function of the marginal physical product. So now you put in your upward sloping supply curve of labor. You get your labor input. You put your labor input into your short run production function, and you get your output. How many have seen this before? One person?
I think we did it.
Wait, you don't? Do they not teach micro anymore?
It's been a while, yeah.
Okay, now what this is illustrating is the concept of derived demand. All right? The demand for factors of production is derived from the demand for the consumption goods that may actually end up contributing to the output of it. Right? Now, you have many stages of production, but ultimately, the demand for all factors of production is derived from the demand for consumption, and in long-run equilibrium, factors of production all the factors of production tend to earn their marginal physical product in real terms. Now, when you get to Mankiw's chapter 7, right, he moves from this labor relationship, fixing the capital stock and technology, right? What does he do? He now gives you a short-run production function in which he varies the capital stock, initially holding the input of labor and technology constant. And it assumes that the capital stock exhibits diminishing returns. So if you were to sort of summarize the main assumptions of the Solow model, right? In other words, I said all growth theories except that investment depends on savings. Saving above depreciation increases the capital stock, increases in the capital stock, and lead to increases in output. What are the three assumptions that the Solow model adds to that? People save at a constant percentage of their income, or if you want to be more generous, you could say that the rating of savings is exogenous. In other words, people save 5% of their income, 10% of their income, some constant number unless that shifts. The rate of depreciation is a physical constant. In other words, the capital stock depreciates at some constant number every year. Might be 5%, might be 10%, might be 3%. And that there are diminishing returns to capital. And next week I'm going to argue why all three of those assumptions are wrong. Are dubious.
What was the first one again?
People save at a constant percentage of their income. Or, I mean, to be fair, it's assuming that the saving rate is an important variable and it's exogenous. So, just as a downward sloping demand curve can shift outward or inward, but in the short run we can assume that the schedule remains relatively constant for the short run. The Solow model is assuming that the rate of savings can change, that it remains relatively constant. I mean, relatively constant over the movements that you look at in the Solow model, right? Moving to the steady state. It's assuming that the saving rate is remaining constant, which means it's assuming that the rate of interest has no impact on the saving rate. And the same thing with the rate of depreciation. I mean, that should strike you as immediate, as obviously dubious.
I've actually had a hard time with that in previous classes.
Yeah, the rate of depreciation is a choice variable. It's not a physical constant, right? You can use china plates or you can use paper plates, and so. It's not. It shouldn't be an exogenous variable. It should be an endogenous variable.
So are these assumptions people make because they don't know any better, or because it's too hard to measure the actual?
These are assumptions that are made in order to simplify the analysis.
The problem I have with it was it's assuming that it's a constant rate.
Yeah.
Right. But for me, that's like, for example, I thought of my car, right? Like the first few miles that I put on my car, it's not going to depreciate the car as much as the last mile that I put on my car.
Right. Well, not to be put in the position of defending the Solow model, but what a defender of the Solow model would say is if you have a population of cars at different ages, and that the same number are, in other words, they're all at different ages, but the same number at each age remains constant, then the average of all the cars that could be made. That's how they would try to get around that. But I mean, my criticism is more fundamental. It's clear that there's a different depreciation rate for different forms of capital. But whether, you can build cars that depreciate in a year. You could build cars that depreciate in 1,000 years, right? I mean, technologically it's possible. It's really a choice. And that choice depends on not just technology, but also the interest rate and other factors. And so to treat this as an exogenous variable, I think is one simplification too far.
Only one simplification.
Well, the other simplifications are I mean, you've already anticipated, if you read Ben Powell's, I've gone over time, so if you read Ben Powell's article, right, what is he saying about the capital stock? He's saying that this assumption of diminishing returns is based on a single capital good. When you have a heterogeneous assortment of capital goods with complementarities, right, there's no reason to assume diminishing returns to capital. I mean, there's a sense in which it's true. There's a sense in which if Tom Hanks on his deserted island, right, increases his capital stock by making one fishing spear, and then a second fishing spear, and then a third fishing spear, and then a fourth fishing spear, then you're going to have diminishing returns to capital. If a firm that is using computers increases its investment by adding one computer after another, right, without adding anything else, then yes, you're going to have diminishing returns. But that's not the way capital works in the real world, right? Capital is linked together in this structure. A hammer makes a nail more productive, not less productive. Anyway, don't get me.